then are drugs which reinforce obsessive and unexamined and self-destructive behavior patterns. Well, what do psychedelics do? They destroy behavior patterns, destroy cultural assumptions, completely hold everything up for grabs, completely throw open the possibility that reality could be any of a number of ways that are not culturally sanctioned. So in that sense, the psychedelics are almost the answer to the drug problem. And the early use of psychedelics reported spectacular progress with alcoholism. Well, now see, the people who believe that alcoholism is a disease, and I don't follow this literature closely, it seems to me this is a preposterous statement. I mean, a disease? You mean like influenza and smallpox and AIDS? Alcoholism is a disease? Can you get it if you don't practice safe sex, or do you have to wash your eating utensils? It isn't a disease. What it is it's a failure of self-image. And the reason LSD in many cases had a tremendous impact on alcoholic behavior was because it just showed people what they were doing. It said, this is you. You're a drunk. You're a burden to your family, a bore to your friends. You smell bad and you're useless. How do you like it? And so somebody said, I don't like it. I said, well, then stop drinking. That's what it is. That's how psychedelics cure addiction. And nobody, when they talk about addiction, nobody ever talks about what is called self-restraint.
There's a new book that came out about a month or two ago. Incredibly, I don't remember the name offhand. Incredibly controversial.
But alcoholism?
Yeah, that
heavy drinking. Myth of alcoholism is a disease.
Right. Yeah, and the man takes the position that the last 30 or 40 years, where we've seen alcoholism as a disease, is just more bullshit from the medical model. We need another alternative. And of course, AA and everybody's just up in arms about the book.
Well, yeah, AA has.
I don't remember now.
What did you say? The name of the book is it's by Finnegrad. It's called Heavy Drinking: The Myth of Alcoholism as a Disease. Basically, it discusses the fact that it's a rationalization to say that it's a disease. I mean, there are certain people I think that have certain chemical reactions to alcohol, but they're in the minority, and that this is very important to me as well because this is work that I'm interested in. And alcoholism has also touched my family, as it has a lot of families. And
yeah, I think the disease model has there's no responsibility involved, And AA, their position, their goal is not to understand the nature of the universe. They're not in the philosophy business. They're trying to get people to stop drinking. So to maximize that goal, I think that they go far overboard. First of all substances, they say, if you're an alcoholic, then you must forswear everything. I don't know how they relate to tobacco. But see, what you've got to understand is we are set up for addiction. It's just like language and cognition and all of these other things. We are the animal which addicts. Other animals don't addict. And addiction is a way of relating to the world. We don't not only addict to drugs, we addict to each other, to chunks of territory, to behavior patterns.
Like attaching ourselves to what we see,
Exactly. It's attachment. We attach to everything. And it's very real. It's physiological. I remember years and years ago, a woman left me for a homunculus, and I was appalled. And it became. I was like vomiting every 4 hours. Could not sleep. Would burst into tears in inappropriate situations, of which there were many in my life. And heroin withdrawal cannot be worse than that. I mean, are you kidding? Vomiting every 4 hours? And And then one night, in the middle of the night, I was just frantic because I felt like when I was awake, I felt like I wanted to be asleep. When I should have been sleeping, I couldn't sleep, and I was just dragging myself to classes. I felt, this is crazy. I should turn myself in, but they don't have crisis centers for broken hearts. What are you going to do? So then, in the middle of one of these bouts, I went to the medicine cabinet, and this woman who had left me had left all these pills there. And I sorted through all these pills and came upon a small bottle of tranquilizers, of a very mild tranquilizer, like Valium or something. Well, I had never taken a Valium. So I said, I'll take half. And I took it, and the next morning, or a few hours later, I went out to breakfast, and somebody came up and sat at my table and said, well, how are you coping since Hermione left you? And I said, who? I just jerk, and it really gave me respect for tranquilizers. I mean, I was appalled. I was appalled that something so real to me, so much me, half the tab, I didn't care, let him go. And then I realized all the people around me, this is how they deal with emotional crisis. Nobody wants to feel anything. I mean, the moment that an unpleasant emotion rears its head, people go take Valium or something else and cut themselves off from feeling. We addict to people. That's the point of that story. And when they leave us suddenly, it's just like having your heroin taken away and you become a mad thing for months, years sometimes. I mean, I still vibrate from this event, and it was 15 years ago. We addict to territory. This is war, our turf, our land. Now, this arises, again, a consequence of agriculture. Before agriculture, nobody had land. Land was something you walked around on as you migrated behind your herds. Once it was cognized as an object and fixed upon, they were ready to knock the other guy's brains out for setting foot on your territory. We all do this. I mean, we are addicted to caffeine, outrageous caffeine addictions, money, sugar, praise, television. Now, this is the favorite one to talk about because television is a forerunner of very insidious drugs to come. It's just the crudest and the first. But imagine if after World War II, a drug had been introduced into this country of right-thinking, hard-working, decent Christian people, such that 20 years after its induction, the average American citizen would be spending 6.5 hours per day involved in this drug. That's the figure for television consumption in this country. The average American watches 6.5 hours a day of TV. It is an electronic drug. It is an obsessive behavior pattern, an unconscious behavior pattern, and a physically destructive behavior pattern. I mean, it's done more for the rebirth of hemorrhoid specialists than any other single force in our society. So, but people say, well, that's not a drug, that's entertainment. 6.5 hours a day of entertainment? You know, before electronic media, a person could regard themselves as a great patron of, let's say, the musical community, and maybe they would hear 12 live musical performances a year when they would go to a theater. I mean, how many people in Beethoven, how many experts on Beethoven in his generation or the generation following heard, let's say, the Ninth Symphony more than several times in their intellectual life? Because, you know, you have to get a lot of people together and cooperating to perform the Ninth Symphony. To us, the Ninth Symphony is an object. Listen to it. Listen again. Listen again. We are able to turn experience, we are able to objectify experience and then addict ourselves to it. Well, is this bad? How can it be bad if it is so written into us? I don't think it is bad. I think what we have to do is choose our addictions, choose our behavior patterns. I mean, one can choose to be addicted to punctuality. I'm accused of this. Other people are addicted to always being late. One can be addicted to, meaningless sexual encounters.
Some different in habits and addictions.
You mean because of the physiological angle? Well, I think that's been much overplayed. I think, should we not fall in love because we pheromonally lock together with this person and become a single unified set of drives and goals? The physiological aspects of addiction have been, I think, very strongly overdrawn. I smoke cannabis every day at most opportunities and have for years and years, since I was 18 years old. Every once in a while, I stop just to see what that's like. It's trivial. It's utterly easy. All that happens is a shift in behavior patterns. I read more. That's what happens when I stop smoking cannabis. And yet I'm supposed to be breaking out into cold sweats, wandering aimlessly through the streets of the city, staring up at lighted windows. Yeah, right. So I think we give each other too much permission to be weak in this area. What is never talked about in talk about addiction is self-restraint. For heaven's sake, just take hold of yourself. Yeah, responsibility. And if you tell people addiction is a disease, addiction is it's because you're black, it's because you're poor, it's because you're this, it's because you're that, you have just given them a whole bunch of reasons not to take responsibility for their own situation. And what is needed in these addictive situations, I think, is the shock of recognition. I believe, that if you don't take drugs, you're unbearable. And I can't think of a society on earth where people don't take drugs that any of us would want to have anything to do with. Let's take Calvinist Geneva, say. I imagine that as an example of an environment of moral rectitude. These people did not wear bright colors, didn't listen to music, never drank coffee, never smoked, forget about alcohol, sex for procreation, so forth and so on. And they are paradigms of the male ego frozen in place, didactic, paternalistic, all-knowing, filled with hellfire and damnation. Everything is seen in terms of a moral dimension that makes impossible demands on the human animal. Rather, I think what we should realize is that somehow our evolution into a civilized, self-reflecting being is caught up in these synergistic relationships that our conscious mind has with various things in the environment, so that we should choose our addictions. Now notice that addictions, to my mind, and you can argue with this if you want by choosing extreme examples, but addictions to natural substances are harmless. Let me name some natural substances that you might disagree with me on this point. I think probably the strongest one would be, people would say, well, what about opium? Surely this is the scourge of mankind. Actually, opium was never a problem in human populations until it was conceived of as a problem by British colonial policymakers who decided that they could manipulate the opium trade to get an entree into China. Alcohol was never a problem, particularly, until the discovery of distilled alcohol. And, of course, heroin is distilled opium, morphine also. Sugar is a refined vegetable substance. In every case, it has required the intercession of science and technology to take harmless habits and turn them into dangerous addictions, so that everybody has a solution to the drug problem. I think what I would suggest is something called the Vegetable Drug Act, where you just say, if it's a vegetable, it's not a drug. This was the position until very recently with British common law. In Canada, mushrooms were legal. Mushrooms aren't psilocybin. Psilocybin is a refined chemical. If it is technology which allows us then to create these super powerful addicting substances, and there will be more and more of them downstream, you may be sure. So I think what we need to do is think of human beings as hardware, as the computer, if you will, and drugs are forms of software. And the software that you run determines the kind of functions that you can perform. If you run distilled alcohol software, well, then you take on the persona of the alcoholic. I believe that cannabis is probably the most harmless and benign drug around. It carries out this feminizing that I talked about. It lowers the profile of the male ego. Instead of wanting to duke it out, people just say, well, if that's your thing, And that's what we need, I mean, that practically boils down to what we call tolerance. So I think that this disruption of our relationships to psychoactive plants is what set us on the long, hard, downward path into neurosis. And it began with agriculture, with the narrowing of our spectrum of plant awareness from many, many plants down to the rye, the oats, the barley. And it's interesting that then out of this came the cultivation of, I think beer preceded wine. Beer is an older thing than wine. That comes out of the fact of having created surpluses, because the way beer was discovered was through the fermentation of grain that was stored. If you didn't have surpluses, you would never discover the psychoactive properties of fermented grain. It's very interesting. In Nepal, the Newari people have an alcoholic beverage that when it's put in front of you, it looks like a bowl of granola. It's dry. They pour it out of a sack into your cup, and you say, this is beer? And then they come along with boiling water and pour it over it, and then you get this foamy, lightly fermented, contaminated grain water. And to my mind, that clearly is then how fermentation of grains and production of alcohol was established. Notice that it was also the accumulation of surplus from the agricultural adaptation that creates the need for defense. Because now you've got a surplus. Now you have to guard your surplus from everybody who doesn't have any. The other thing that creation of surpluses caused was the invention of barter and money and this sort of thing, because now you have something that you can trade for something that you don't have. So all of these adaptations, also a nomadic people cannot move a grain surplus with them. So if your harvest one year, if you're a semi-nomadic people, that's a people who, like in the Amazon, they plant things and then they leave them and go away, and they have like a yearly peregrination, and when they come back to that place a year later, there's all this food ready for them. Well, imagine a nomadic people who were doing that kind of quasi-agriculture with cereal, and then there's 1 year of great weather and great rainfall, and when they arrive at their little wheat patch, so much wheat has been produced that they can't move it. They can't take it with them. So then they say, well, but we have food now, so we don't have to keep hunting, so let's spend the winter here. And this interruption of the cycle of nomadism to deal with unexpected surpluses obviously spawned the idea in people's minds, well, wouldn't it be great if we had surpluses every year? And then that says, well, that won't happen if we're as careless as we have been about our sowing and harvesting, but maybe if we're very careful and till the land and carefully plant and do careful weeding, we'll have to stay here and weed, but then we'll get this tremendous payback in the end. So, to my mind, the invention of agriculture broke our relationship to the wild plants and the lowered profile of the male ego, and set us on a path of defending wealth, creating fortifications, supporting more specialization, larger populations, so forth and so on. And from there to the present predicament, it's only a moment. Pardon me?
Lots of consequences stem from that too. Such, fear of losing your wealth, then consequently fighting to protect it.
That's right.
Lots of consequences.
And also this idea of our land, because you want to hang on to this good cereal growing land, so it's yours, you say, and then you put a wall around it, and then you defend it, and so forth and so on. Well, yeah.
Just one quick, where do you see this going? Where do you see taking this break of nature and the position that we've gotten ourselves in? How do you see it?
Well, I think that things are very far out of hand, and we're caught up now in the end game of history, and that we are going to have to create a way out of this impasse that is probably going to mean a complete redefining of who we are and how we relate to each other, and space and time and life and death. And it appears that technology is now the thing that is guiding us forward. We are not being led into the future by politicians. Politicians are running frantically along behind the wagon of history, trying to jump onto it. What is leading us, what's pulling the cart, is technology. And I think technology is the program of realizing the practical concerns of the imagination, and that really where we are headed is the imagination. It's a place. I don't know whether it's in solid-state circuitry or in the bones of the planet or in artificial arcologies in deep space. The future will figure out the details, but we are close enough to it now that we can anticipate it. It's what the shamans always said was possible. A world of value and meaning lived in the light of nature. And I think if we can get through this narrow neck that rationalism has imposed upon us and overcome these poisonous, paternalistic philosophies, we will return. That's why I call it the archaic revival. It's the myth of the eternal return. History is something that you finish with as quickly as possible and then return to the archaic mode of eternity. And I think that's the adventure that we're all caught up in. That's the agenda that the plants and the planet have always had in front of them. It's just that we wandered away from an awareness of what was happening by deluding ourselves with our own inflated self-image. Man as master of woman and nature. And this distorted part of our self-image has now become so dangerous to us that we have to abandon it. We have to draw back from it. And under that kind of pressure, I think we will. So, harking back to another question, the reason I do this and the reason I don't feel any great trepidation about it is because I believe that historical momentum is with us. This is what is destined to come to be. We are going to take control of who we are by taking control of the physiological and psychological foundations upon which the self rests. And that means the chemical re-engineering of ourselves into the state of Edenic innocence that was lost when we set out on the long trail of the sword and the hoe, basically. That's it. End of weekend. Thank you very, very much. It's a political point of view, you see, and as a practical matter, there's no better way to succeed in politics than to champion the most out of it point of view. And now we live in an era where beige fascism is apparently the rising rule of the day. Well, that means if you want to be on the cutting edge, you have to embrace something very akin to psychedelic anarchy, the absolute antithesis of the fascist state. And then you will participate in the turning of the tide and the vindication of this point of view. And it will be vindicated, there's no doubt about it. All other points of view are bankrupt on the face of them. End of footnote. Mm-hmm.